and welcome to this special program on the South Asia Economic Conclave. I have with me my participants who are going to be speaking to me about the benefits of regional cooperation and the experiences so far. The immediate question as to why this is the right time, and I'd like to ask Dr. Kumaraswamy about his experiences so far.
I think India's attitude towards the neighborhood, the sea change that has taken place, is a potential game changer. Clearly, India has come to the conclusion that prosperity and stability in the region would serve its interests in terms of pursuing its own global agenda as a rising world power. So I think the rest of the region has an opportunity arising from that. The other point to be made is that there are specific things happening in India now. India is, by common consent, going to be the fastest growing large economy in the world in the foreseeable future. That creates opportunities for all the countries in the region. If, for instance, connectivity is being improved, the backlog on investment in the whole region is being addressed, so connectivity is being improved, the trade facilitation bottlenecks, the infrastructure weakness, there's a long way to go. But I think all the countries in the region are now realize that they need to move decisively on all these fronts, and that is happening. And if, for instance, the GST goes through in India and there's a movement to a single market, that clearly will not only boost growth in India, but also create opportunities for the region. So there are lots of things happening within India which can benefit the region. On the Sri Lankan side, if I may, the concerns about greater integration stem from two factors. One is the asymmetry between India and the other economies in the world, particularly a small economy like Sri Lanka. But there are tried and tested ways of handling this asymmetry, particularly as India has accepted the principles of non-reciprocity and special and differential treatment.
And Dr. Kumaraswamy, I'm going to come back to you on that, but I just want to focus a little bit on the political and geostrategic perspective that Mr. Saran can, of course, tell us about. And again, I'm trying to understand why this is really the right time to push harder and perhaps push in a different way than what we've seen. So what are your thoughts on that?
International trade, from being a major driver of growth, has in fact become a bit of a drag on growth. And in that kind of a situation, countries like India and its South Asian neighbors have to look for other drivers for growth. And in that context, in fact, there are huge opportunities which exist within the region itself to, in fact, drive growth. And there are many low-hanging fruits, because it is just by, in fact, improving what are known as at the border procedures, behind the border transactional costs. If you reduce those, in fact, you are going to see a very major increase in growth in all the countries of the region. Secondly, as you know, there are other major mega trade blocks coming up. You know, you have the TPP in our own region, you have the TTIP. All these are going to have a very major impact on countries in the region. So if you actually work together, you are far better placed to deal with those challenges than you would if you were not working together.
Mr. Munjal, the question I want to ask you is that given the kind of opportunities you're seeing elsewhere in the world, why is it still important for you to look into South Asia as great potential for doing better business with as a region?
There are two different aspects to this. One is for us, particularly as a company, and two is for us as India. Let me focus on the India piece first, because I'm doing this a little bit more for India than for ourselves as an individual enterprise. If you see worldwide, the largest part of the business that is done is within the region. In fact, it's as high as 62% of the trade that gets transacted in every region of the world is within the region itself, except in our region. And this happens because of the relationship or lack of it within the region. So I think it's absolutely critical as the economy grows that we start to focus more and more in the immediate neighborhood. Second, it's also clear to the entire world that the growth is today coming from areas in Asia more than any other part of the world. Two major crises in the last decade have shown that the big growth in the next 10 to 15 years at least is going to come from this part of the world. And some of the economies like China and India are already showing themselves up as leading growth economies in the world. So it would make eminent sense for us to start to grow this island of excellence. And for that reason, it is important that South Asia starts to focus a lot more internally on itself than it has done for a while now. As to a second part, for us as a business, clearly, if you can do more business in the neighborhood, it's always more convenient for any organization for a variety of reasons.
Let me ask you another question, which is how can we really boost private partnerships in this region? I mean, given the fact that there have been dialogues, people have been talking for a long time, what are some of the key changes one really needs to see taking place?
I can think of three right away.
Okay.
One is physical infrastructure. Physical connectivity between the neighboring region needs to improve, whether it's road connectivity, rail connectivity, or flights. Today it's hard to get flights to go, it's easier to get a flight to go to London or to France or to Italy than it is to go to your immediate neighborhood. That needs to change. Second is a visa regime today is not user-friendly. It's very hard to get visas even to go to Pakistan, for example. And it's the same for Pakistanis to come to India. It's very tough to get a visa. So if you can't travel to each other's countries, how can you actually do business? How can you successfully do at least a growth-oriented business is not possible, because you will send more and more people both sides if you're doing either investments or trade. So I think that's another area which needs attention. The third is the SAFTA arrangement that we have been talking of for a long time. I think we need to take a hard look and see what can we do to actually make it work. So these are the three areas I can immediately think of which would need some attention and which could actually significantly move the needle for these countries to start doing more together. There seems to be intent in the leadership in each of these countries today, at least a stated intent amongst all the leaders. Individually, when you meet with people, it's a very wonderful, warm feeling. Sure. People are very friendly. As businesses, there's a clear opportunity. If you just look at the sheer numbers that you have in this part of the world, it is a compelling argument for us to focus on doing more business with each other.
Ms. Dixon, this is where I'd like to come in and ask you this, because you've, of course, spent your time as country director in Southeast Asia. You've had your experiences. You've seen how the greater Mekong sub-region has really achieved that successful model of achievement. What can we possibly learn in South Asia to really learn from those positive examples? What can you share with us with that?
Well, I think firstly, the Southeast Asian experience shows that countries, even of different size and yes. Even with difficult history and political challenges, have been able to come together. And ASEAN has been a tremendous driver even for the smaller countries in the region to basically integrate. If you take Laos, for example, it's a small country in Southeast Asia. Its national development strategy is anchored firstly in power trade, developing its hydro potential to be a supplier of electricity to the region. They call themselves the battery of Southeast Asia, and also to be a land link to the rest of the region. And I think that last example is directly relevant for the South Asia countries. You can take, for example, Afghanistan. Its strategy is to essentially be a land link and a link for power trade in the region, with power surplus electricity coming from Central Asia through Afghanistan into Pakistan. You can see it on the northeast of the region, where this potential also exists for Bhutan and Nepal, for example, to supply electricity to energy deficit countries, Bangladesh, India, examples. So this is a tremendous potential lesson for South Asia. And I think the other thing is that even when there is difficult history and difficult political or security issues going on, countries have been able to cooperate on the economic front and find the space to continue to move forward. And I think this is an important lesson for South Asia as well.
So, Dr. Mehta, what do you think are key game changers or low-hanging fruits, as we call them, in terms of really making things move within the region at this stage?
Well, I think we need to change the terms of discourse. I mean, I think we are so obsessed with low-hanging fruit, and with low-hanging fruit, we will aim only low.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
I think the biggest thing we have to understand is, look, all of South Asia is at this very critical point in its demographic dividend, right? It's a continent full of young people, and the first genuinely post-colonial generation, right? If this generation misses this opportunity of overcoming the past historical obstacles, then frankly South Asia has no future. Okay? Second, let's be very clear, you cannot think of a single problem that besets each individual country in South Asia, that has a unilateral solution. Climate change, right? The single biggest ecological challenge facing us, right, will have to require a subcontinental sort of level solution. We are all democracies,
yes,
right? It's a unique moment in that respects, but these are democracies plagued by internal issues of minority rights and human rights. You cannot resolve these issues unless there is a region-wide consensus, because otherwise the politics of one country plays into the politics of the other. So I'll just put it bluntly, I mean, we are 60 years too late, and I think we have an extraordinary opportunity, particularly amongst young people, right, to actually shift these terms of discourse from low-hanging fruit,
yes,
to saying, how can we imagine something that's actually exciting? If we keep talking the bureaucratic language of low-hanging fruit,
so change
it's not going to excite people, right?
So, Dr. Karim, how do you perceive these ideas of let's change the discourse, forget about this business about low-hanging fruit, and really think about how you can change the mindset going forward? What are your thoughts on that?
I think I'll pick up on the word you mentioned, mindset. For almost 70 years now, South Asia has been hostage to its own, what I call the partition syndrome. When the land was partitioned, we also partitioned the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the ecosphere. And the biggest partitions were within our heads. And I think right now we have come to a point where we are beginning to realize that we are 60 years late, too late perhaps, but it's never too late. There are movements now of people coming together, realizing that our destiny is with each other. And we are part of a global community, but we cannot be part of that global community unless we realize our regional aspirations and the regional potentials that exist. Shyam mentioned about the market right next door, and where the international market is going to be unpredictable. This region alone offers to itself a market of 1.5 billion people, which has not been explored. When SAARC started, inter-regional trade was 2.5%. It's in the last 25 years, it has doubled to 5%. That sounds, great, 100%, but that's 5% still in absolute terms.
What are some successful examples you can tell us about in terms of how a different kind of dialogue can really enable change?
Well, I think, for instance, in Sri Lanka, as I said, some of the concerns relate to asymmetry, and people say, well, look, the Indo-Lanka Free Trade Agreement has not delivered in the way we expected. The Sri Lanka-Pakistan Free Trade Agreement has not. But I think really if one unpacks the headline figures, 80% of Sri Lankan exports to India come on preferential terms. But only about 20% of Indian exports to Sri Lanka come on preferential terms. So really, if you look at trade under the FTA, it's pretty balanced. Trade has increased. It has not increased as much as we would like, but some of the things that we talked about in terms of having to improve the overall trading environment, I think apply, and it'll get better. The other, I think, trade has increased, but not as much as it should have done.
Okay.
Where there has been significant improvement, certainly in Sri Lanka, is Indian investment into Sri Lanka. India has been the main source of foreign investment into Sri Lanka. So you've already seen, and really it's that trade investment nexus that small countries can leverage to take advantage of regional cooperation. So I think pressing ahead on investment, on creating a better trading environment, reducing the cost of trade. Already we're beginning to see results, and we could have more.
If we can find a way to make South Asia work better together, you will actually be firing on all engines. And one of the best things we can do for ourselves, both as individuals, as corporates, and as nations, is to look at how we can grow our economies by looking at each other as trade partners to address what our real issues are. Poverty, ecology, education, health, skills. The only way to address these is through more economic activity. If you have a positive program and you have the tools available already, and as Dr. Mehta said, this is the first time, if you look at the leadership in all these countries, they are all current leaders.
Yes.
And there are tools available to us in terms of technology and communication, which will allow you to do things in a fraction of the time in which you could do them even a couple of decades earlier.
So what is different today is that India is on board, and it is really for India to bring about the kind of change that we are talking about. For example, if we are talking about the market for 1.5 billion people, frankly speaking, if you just opened your borders to goods and services from your neighbors, it would still be a fraction of the Indian economy. And yet, look at what it would do to the economic prospects of your neighbors. So the mindset change that we are talking about becomes very important. If you are looking at what was mentioned by Pratap as the younger generation, frankly speaking, unless you have that young generation right in front of you as the object of whatever we are trying to do, giving them employment opportunities, giving them a future, then unless you are able to work together in the region, you cannot provide that. It's simply not feasible. So I think in terms of how do we bring about that change, how do we deepen that relationship, all these aspects can actually be fast-tracked by a lead taken by India. Because the asymmetry which seems to be an obstacle, actually in this case, the asymmetry becomes the asset. This is the reality.
Ms. Dixon, I just want to ask you about cooperation, which can take place on multiple levels, whether it's multilateral or bilateral level. There are many ways that this can happen. Can you cite a few examples of how the World Bank has perhaps been working together with the region, and some successful lessons we can really learn in terms of what we're talking about right here?
Well, I think firstly it's really important that there's some tangible projects that get underway that build confidence. And here the World Bank and other international partners can provide convening, a space to convene. If it's difficult to do it bilaterally, we can actually help with multilateral engagement. And, we can support regional projects that actually do help countries to cooperate. We're doing this with Afghanistan and Pakistan, helping them to develop electricity transmission lines with Central Asia. We're doing it on inland waterways to help reconnect the river transport that traditionally used to exist in the region. And there are many other ways we can do this. I do think it's important to build confidence and trust, and this needs to happen in energy, in transport, in trade, in natural resource management, and particularly in water management, because water is a strategically important shared resource in the region. But it also needs to happen people to people. I think one thing that's really important is that young people study abroad, travel abroad, meet each other, and this will be a critical part of the mindset change that needs to happen in the region.
Look, all of us are still consolidating nation states, but I think we've all also come to the realization that the process of further regional cooperation now is actually a means of strengthening our individual nation states. It is not in contradiction to that. I think that basic realization, is now much deeper than was the case 25, 30 years ago, where there always used to be this trade-off, between national consolidation and sharing sovereignty. Now, actually, in a sense, a more creative version of sovereignty is a way of advancing each of our national interests.
So you've played an instrumental role in important developments between India and Bangladesh. And, you know, this whole idea of reciprocity and also the unilateral concessions and what they can actually generate. Going forward, you know, what would you like to share with us on that?
You see, if you imagine South Asia as an economic engine that has to zoom off somewhere, the economic engine needs 2 or 3 components before it will start. When you turn the ignition, the engine has to fire. The different cylinders have to fire in unison. And even if it does fire, you need petrol in the tank before the car will go out of your porch. These are the two. So the electrical circuitry is the politics. They have to fire in unison. And energy or availability of power, ready power, is what will enable the engine to move. Now, we are talking of development, industrialization, everything. Remember that when the beginnings of the European Union of today started with one treaty on the European coal and steel community. That was brought together by 2 largest powers in Europe at that time, former enemies. And to address that, the European industrial landscape was a wasteland. They needed the steel to rebuild. They needed power, availability of energy to rebuild. Okay. Today, as Pratap mentioned, we need to think out of our national skills. In Bangladesh, French and Germans are building a Franco-German embassy, the first of its kind that the European Union has gone to. I would like to hope that one day SAARC will also be thinking similarly, or at least to begin with, have the national flags of the SAARC countries flying side by side with the SAARC flag. We have, in the last 60 to 70 years, I think our identities are set. This is the new generation. It has grown up post-partition. They have different aspirations. We should not quibble or have fears about anybody chipping away at our identity. It's a question of how do we re-aggregate these identities to think of a South Asian identity. And that is, I think we are at the cusp of that. It will take some time.
Is it a possibility?
So I think it is something which is already happening in a sense, because of the fact that today the generation that is the first post-colonial generation that has been talked about has a mindset which is very different from the generation that we have had post-independence, who do not have much patience with the kind of, prejudices, with the kind of mental, attitudes which have really defined the earlier generation. They are looking for the future. They are looking for realizing their aspirations.
Sure.
And if South Asia is not able to come together and actually provide for that, be relevant to its younger people, then as Pratap mentioned, you have lost the plot. And you are really not going to be the kind of, vanguard of the Asian century.
Sure.
You are going to be at the very end of the Asian century. So I think it is really a stark choice that has to be made. And I certainly see signs of that happening. I would certainly want to see that happen much more quickly than it has been so far.
Well, I think part of the reason why we're all together here having this discussion is because one has, as you said, seen signs, but you'd like to see it happening a little faster. Just before I finish, once again, coming to you, Ms. Dixon, in terms of the successful models that you've seen, are there any patterns that you think appear that can be broken that appear repeatedly that should be broken in terms of making these projects a little smoother when it comes to collaboration?
Well, look, I have no doubt it can happen. It has happened in Europe, as my colleagues have said. It's happening in Africa at the moment. It's happening in Southeast Asia. It can happen here. The point is it has to happen here.
Well, I'd like to thank all my panelists for the special show on Bloomberg TV India. Programming continues.